Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everybody for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those wondering why we pair those games together, perhaps you're new to the show, welcome to the show, happy to have you here. It's because they all share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So as the theory goes, if we dive into Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, we can better understand the world that Avowed is going to be set in, and therefore appreciate the nuance and the writing and the questing that we will see in that game. As well, for those of us who just really love the world and the Pillars of Eternity games, it's an opportunity for us to learn about the lore and just geek out about it all. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about some of the notable saints within different religions across the world of Eora, and then I'm going to ask the question, which one of them would win in a fight? It's the Saints' War, if you will, but not the Saints' War, if you know what that is. This information comes to us from the Pillars of Eternity 2 guidebook, which is an actual hardcover book that you have to hold in your hands and read, unless you have the digital version, I guess. And it's not containing information well, there is information in this that is in the game, but it does contain information such as some things I'm going to read today that aren't in the actual game. And I actually also couldn't find fandom articles about them as well. So some of this information you can only get if you have this book. I'm not going to just read the entire section of this book verbatim. That would be A, very lazy, and also B, a little bit, not stealing, but I don't know, it feels a little dirty to me. So I'll be doing a little bit more paraphrasing, just kind of talking about the stories of these saints from the history throughout Eora. No other news to go over today about the show or the Obsidian or likewise. Grounded is about to release on other platforms, which is exciting if you're really into that game. Personally, I'm a huge fan of that game. It's a wonderful, it's honestly the cream of the crop, in my opinion, for survival crafting games, especially with the shared world feature. That's really, honestly, it's super great. I might get it on the Nintendo Switch. Other than that, I've been considering joining a podcast network, which I talked about last episode, and I've gotten some feedback. I thank you for it. I'm still hoping more people will also give feedback on their thoughts about this show joining a podcast network or not. But other than those things, which we've already talked about, there's nothing else. So let's just dive straight into today's lore.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So as I mentioned, all of today's information comes from the Pillars of Eternity 2 guidebook, the official Deadfire Archipelago volume of all the lore that's going on for the game. Very good if you're thinking of doing a tabletop role-playing game set in the Deadfire Archipelago. This is going to be an instrumental piece of work that you can have to help you understand the world and also create your stories out of. Some of the things that we talk about today might even give you ideas. But there is a section in the book, chapter 8, I believe, called Saints and Relics. They talk about different religious figures throughout the history of the world, and they kind of give one per region of the world, not one per religion, but one kind of in each different region of the world where different cultures and people groups are, a religious figure or icon or somebody infamous even that is just, they're a saint, they're worth talking about. And I'm going to get these together. We're going to talk about who each of them are and their stories. And I'm going to ask the question at the end of who would win in a fight? Or, what advantages does one have over the other? I don't want to be so shallow as to just say who would win in a fight. But it is interesting to think what their tactics that each of these individual people would be in subduing the others, we'll say. So we're going to be talking about Saint Kamatu the White, Saint Kadza the Negotiator, Saint Wamoth the Grove, Saint Agata the Blind, and Saint Grotesque in the Captain, which that one's a particularly fun one. So first off is Saint Kamatu the White. So I'm going to read this first paragraph from here, and then I'm going to paraphrase after that. The infamy of Saint Kamatu begins with his birth. Having come into the world with depleted white hair and ragged skin of an elder, none of his tribal midwives expected him to survive. When he pulled through and grew healthy, however, Mataru priests struggled to judge him on his caste in the basis of his soul, and so left him to be raised with his Raparu mother. Now, if you're not familiar with the lore of the second Pillars of Eternity game especially, then a lot of that might sound confusing to you. This person who was born into the world with white hair and ragged skin looking like an old person, based on the description given in the following sentences, it's very obvious that he was born into the Huana culture. The Huana peoples are the native populations that exist within the Second Pillars of Eternity game. The Deadfire Archipelago, which is a location or an area within the globe that is Eora, is a series of islands, as the word archipelago implies, and the Huana peoples are the people that live in those islands natively. They have their own unique culture and beliefs and systems that I've done episodes on if you want to hear more about them. One of the interesting things about them is that they do live in a caste society, right? So there are different castes, there are different levels, there are different tiers of citizen, if you will. There's different castes of citizens, which are kind of implied here when it says that when he grew healthy, Mataru priests struggled to judge his caste on the basis of his soul. How it would work in the Huana society is when a person is born, when it is possible, Mataru priests, which are the highest caste within the society, would analyze the soul of a person and determine, based on their analysis, on which caste that person would end up in. Sometimes a child would be born to parents that would then have to be taken away from those parents and put in a different caste within society. This is all normal for these people, and that's just how they lived. The analysis of the soul, if that sounds strange to you because you're new to this show, is a very real thing that can happen in this world. Everyone's soul is a very concrete, tangible object that if you have the right skills and know-how, you can actually analyze and look at, and a whole bunch of stuff. If you're interested in things like that, I do an episode on the soul and the wheel very early in this show's life. But they left Saint Kamatu with his Roparu mother, Roparu being the lowest caste within this system. They were essentially the workers of society, and part of their role was if there was ever a famine within the society itself, that they would be kind of like the first to go, the first ones to die, so that the people who were perpetuating the culture and all that were able to survive. There might be strong opinions on that either way, but that's just kind of the fantasy culture that is created here. Anyways, so some interesting things about Saint Kamatu as he continued on. First off, he never grew taller than 4 feet, which if you've experienced an Amawa person in any sort of a setting, you'll know that that's pretty odd. The Amawa are the biggest and widest of the Kith creatures, which are, humans, elves, dwarves, Amawas, Orlins, the whole shebang. Amawas are the biggest ones. So finding one that only stands like 4 feet tall, very abnormal. Not just kind of short, it's very abnormal. And upon that, he also, it says here, misfortune followed him like a shroud. Crops were starting to fail within this tribe's society. Injuries and sicknesses were becoming more common. Children were even becoming stillborn. At least the rate was increasing. And in this culture, when things like that start to happen alongside the birth of someone who is abnormal or godlike, like I suspect that Kamatu is, they the Mataru priests that is, try to judge whether or not this person is considered a good or bad omen. And as you can guess, that they're judging that the birth of this Kamatu is a bad omen. This doesn't necessarily mean that they will think that Kamatu is a horrible person in their own rights, but that their birth signifies a bad omen. Sometimes it even coincides with that person. So it doesn't tell us how they treated him. I imagine they still didn't treat him very good. When you read between the lines of how the society of the Huana does that, there's nothing in there that says that they would have to mistreat people that are bad omens, but I'm sure it still did. But yeah, his birth was determined to be an omen from the god Remergond, who is the god of entropy and cold, and that's why things were unraveling all around them. Remergond is, like I said, entropy and cold. It's all about unraveling and decay and the finality of death. And so this person being born to their tribe and then these things happening with their crops and their children and sickness and disease, it was very much aligned with the god Remergond. And they even determined that Kamatu himself was kind of a mortal servant of Remergond, that he radiated this aura, if you will, that caused this entropy to enter into the very world around him. The upper class, or the higher caste people, the priests and whatnot, they spent a long time just trying to decide what to do, but eventually the island's resources were depleted and they were forced to leave, which is normal for these Huana people. They are a nomadic society. They pick up and move on to another island, and they live on that island for a generation or whatever, while the previous place regrows all their resources, and they kind of just cycle through islands like that. So, and that's just their lifestyle. However, sadly enough, they did leave Kamatu behind because they kind of made the determination that these things were happening around Kamatu himself, and so they left him on the island by himself as a boy, not a grown-up, but as a boy, to fend on his own. Shortly after leaving the island, though, the Royal Deadfire Company came to this very island. If you're interested in learning about the Royal Deadfire Company and the nation that owns them, Rauatai, I've done episodes on all of those if you want to go check them out. The short version is that the Royal Deadfire Company basically serves the interests of the Rauataian Empire in the Deadfire. The entire purpose of them being there is to try to find or annex, I suppose, land that they can use to grow crops that they can then bring home to feed their population, because the living in Rauatai is very difficult, and so it's getting a little bit difficult to feed everybody and keep everybody at a suitable quality of life when they don't have a lot of resources to go around. So they're going into the world of Eora trying to find that, and the Royal Deadfire Company is doing that here in the Deadfire Archipelago. So anyways, Kamatu's tribe leave him behind on this island. Shortly afterwards, an armada of the Royal Deadfire Company show up on the horizon. They come to the island and they find this boy there. Now, it doesn't go into details of what happens after that, but interpretations of whether or not Kamatu is considered a savior or a misfortune diverges here at this point, because the Royal Deadfire Company is viewed by a lot of Huana people to be aggressors, foreign aggressors. They're just coming in and they're taking land, and they're not moving on like the rest of the Huana people do, right? That's kind of weird from their perspective. They're staying in one area and they're depleting the resources and then not letting it kind of regrow. So they kind of view the Royal Deadfire Company in a lot of negative ways. And in a way, by leaving Kamatu there, they ensured that the Royal Deadfire Company had no resources on this island by which to create another settlement or grow. So in a sort of way, leaving Kamatu, well, not just leaving Kamatu there, but also letting the island's resources completely deplete, meant that in this twist of fate, when the Royal Deadfire Company shows up to this island, they had nothing to take, they had nothing to do, they had no place to settle down. And leaving them with Kamatu would also, by their view, unravel their machinations. And so, in a sense, Kamatu's story is almost that of being a savior in some ways, because he will be an instrument or a weapon against the Royal Deadfire Company. There's still some contention within the tribal societies of whether or not he was a good or bad force, but that's just kind of where the diverging split is. Interestingly enough, on this same page within the guidebook, we actually have an excerpt in the side here. It's a captain's log from the Sea Canker, which, by reading it, was one of the ships that arrived on this island from the Royal Deadfire Company. It goes on to say, "We found a boy amid the abandoned wreckage of the place, alone, crying, hungry. He had a strange look to him, but he was pleased enough to see even an outsider's face. I invited him aboard and fed him the best Rauataian meal I could cook up in short notice. He took a liking to the bowl of sliced apples on my desk. The stories he told troubled me. Of people who rejected him, blamed him for their poor farming habits and every snapped bone. I comforted the boy, told him that my people had come to set the tribes aright. This seemed to please him, and he asked what he could do to help. I told him to sleep in my bunk for the night, with plans to introduce him to our cannons in the morning. As he dozed off, I caught a whiff of something foul. The apples had all rotted black, and the worms broke through the skin. Strange child. The reason for his abandonment grows clearer. Instead of training him to be yet another powder boy, I wonder if I could put him to better use." And so that little journal entry there just kind of talks from a captain's perspective on coming across Kamatu as a boy, who very clearly didn't really have high regard for the people he came from, or at least the tribal society that he came from, that particular group. And it sounds like he kind of aligned right away with the captain's thinking of like, we're going to set these Huana people right. We're going to get them thinking correctly, which, is a dangerous precedent to set, but this is just a boy and he's gone through some traumatic stuff. So I guess we can understand where he's coming from. But anyways, we do see really strong signs here that Kamatu is what would be considered a Remergond godlike, or an entropy godlike. We run into one other such character named Vatnir in the Beast of Winter DLC for this game, the second one. And a Remergond godlike, or an entropy godlike, is someone who does emit kind of an aura of entropy, and things start to unravel around them. Bad luck kind of manifests around them. Things break down, people get sick, tools fail and break, that whole sort of a thing. And this seems to be very indicative with Kamatu the White as well. Not only is he described with the visage of one that kind of matches Vatnir a little bit, but also just that idea that the apples, from just spending an evening in the space that Kamatu was in, were starting to rot. And it's very indicative of Remergond, which gives me the idea that Saint Kamatu is in fact a Remergond godlike. And so that's Kamatu's story. We don't know what happened after that, if the Royal Deadfire Company weaponized him or what happened with him, but apparently there is more of his story to go. If you're playing a tabletop role-playing game, perhaps you can decide what happens. Next up is Saint Kaza the Negotiator. This one's interesting because it's a little bit further back in history. This one occurs in 1220 AI, which if you're not familiar with the calendar of this fantasy world, then that won't mean anything to you. But that is well over 1,500 years earlier than the first Pillars of Eternity game. There's a lot of history between then and now. And so questions of like, what did this person grow up in? What was the society like? Is a very interesting question. Saint Kaza, the tale of her, dates back to 1220 AI in Grand Valia, which you've heard me talk about before. By the time of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, Grand Valia is a defunct society. They've collapsed. The civilization has caved in on itself. They're no more. What is left of them has either moved on to the Valian Republics or become a pirate confederacy known as the Principi San Petrina. But back in 1220 AI, they apparently were a thriving society, and Saint Kaza, the Negotiator, was one of them. She's described as someone who was within the sainthood of Woodica, which is the goddess of justice, law, and rightful rulership, but it is said that Kaza was blessed by Woodica. When Kaza was a child, her hand in marriage was promised to a local farmer for a matter of business and convenience. However, before the ceremony, she managed to negotiate their arrangement or the terms of that with her soon-to-be husband, and he eventually agreed to bequeath all of his land to her for like no conditions at all. Long story short, she ended up walking away from this, not having to marry the man, and pretty much with just buckets and buckets and buckets of money. And whenever people tried to say, like, oh, there was some sort of fraud that was going on in here, people would go through all the records, which were very finely kept, which is pretty normal for someone who follows Woodica. A lot of bureaucrats and judges and lawyers and admin people would be followers of Woodica. And yeah, these things were found to be in proper order. So Kaza didn't do anything tricky. She wasn't tricking people into this stuff. She was just very good at negotiating. The rest of the paragraphs here describing Kaza talk about all the accomplishments she's had and the things that she's been able to convince people of. She basically argued her way to become a vice contessa, someone of high esteem within the Valian society. And she eventually went through his high society and ended up on the throne herself. So she actually ended up becoming the if you want to call him queen, I don't know what else they would call him, basically became the queen of this entire society, all through argument and rhetoric. She was so good at convincing people and negotiating with them for things that posthumously she had a reputation that she could talk her way out of literally anything between using her wits and manipulation of law. They would embellish her exploits, claiming that she could negotiate with Barris, one of the god of death, to sidestep the laws of death, that she could negotiate with Remergond to stall entropy and age, that she could negotiate with the sky itself to produce no rain clouds over her head, or that the ocean would part in her company. Now, obviously, these are just like things of myth and legend right after she died, but still, the idea that she could negotiate anything is really what's being talked about here. And so there you have Saint Kaza. Not so much a story there, but just kind of a demonstration of the great power of a high charisma score within a game. Saint Kaza is usually the kind of player I usually end up playing within a game, if I'm being honest. I really don't like running around and doing a whole bunch of combat. I just want to tell someone to do a thing and then the quest is over. I don't know if that's lazy or whatever, but I don't know. I find it satisfying. So there you go. Now, so far between Kamatu and Kaza, I don't know who would win in a fight, or if one was trying to subdue each other. I suppose Kaza could just convince Kamatu to get away from her, right? And then his powers would kind of be useless against her. I don't know. Interesting thought. Next is Saint Wamod the Grove. I don't know if this is pronounced Wamod or Wamoth, so I'm kind of like mixing the two. The language and the accents and the writing that comes from the white that wends, which is where all the pale elves of this world live. I'm not really exactly sure how that all works, but that's what we're going with. Considering the rarity of travel between temperate climates and ice-strewn inland of the white that wends, which is basically this world's Antarctica, but people can live there, few stories break free of the local pale elf populations and make it to the ears of outsiders. Saint Wamod is one of the rare exceptions. His story is first traded among Valian explorers around 900 AI, so this is even earlier than the one of Saint Kaza, which we just talked about. though it is purported to stem from much older source material. So a little bit of foundational lore for this story here. White that wins, I already said, Antarctica, but people live there. This is where the pale elves of the world live. And it's very interesting how they got there, because they basically just all migrated to the White that wins for no apparent reason that we know of, and en masse. And they have a very interesting relationship with their patron god, Remergod, who I've already talked about, god of cold and entropy and bad luck, amongst other things. So basically the story of Saint Wilmode is that there was a hunting party of pale elves. They were out hunting, as they were. And you gotta understand, the White that wins is just like this vast frozen wasteland for pretty much all of it. I mean, there's herds of musk oxen that they say live here, right? So there's obviously living creatures here, but it's just so much of it is ice and so much of it is snow. It's a barren frozen wasteland in a lot of senses of those words. But they eventually found, in this one area that they were hunting in, they found an oasis of fertile earth which supported dense accumulations of exotic plant life found nowhere else in the region. That's literally what it says here. But yeah, so basically they found this little green patch in the middle of the frozen wasteland, and they're like, what's going on here? When they investigated the grove, they found a person there, and that is the person we're talking about today, Saint Wilmode, although they didn't call him a saint at the time. It was just Wilmode. He was a godlike and a hermit possessing aspects of nature that grew upon his body. The examples they give is that water would drip from his fingertips, pollen would fall from his eyelids, and his fecal matter was saturated with seeds. It's all in the details, baby. He also exuded a syrupy scent, which attracted pollinators and decomposers alike from the insect world. A nice little thing after the fecal matter part. And anyways, it very clearly sounds like Wilmode is what's called a nature godlike. And the godlike, as I've kind of mentioned before, they are associated with different gods. Like they take the visage and they have these like natural auras or natural powers that are associated with a particular god. And it seems like Wilmode would be a godlike associated with Galawain, Lord of the Hunt in all of its forms, god of nature, if you really wanted to try to give him a title like that. And so that kind of seems really in line with what we're seeing here. You could make an argument that it's Hylia, but it's almost certainly Galawain. And so hence the kind of the aura he has. So whereas Saint Kamatu the White had this aura of entropy where things were breaking down and dying around him, this person actually has kind of the opposite almost, that things are coming alive around him. He has all this like natural growth on his body, and everything that comes out of his body can be used for other things to grow and become more alive around him. So this person has almost got an aura of life around him, whereas Kamatu had an aura of death around him. Obviously, these pale elves recognize the raw potential of this person, right? Like, wow, imagine if we brought this person back to our tribe, what that would mean for us. It means that we would be able to like grow food, we would have plentiful resources, and all that kind of a thing. So they try to bring him back. He grudgingly agrees to this, but they didn't really give him much of a choice, so he just kind of like, okay, I'm going to go with you. But he never really gave him a chance to explain why he was a hermit, because, you find a godlike who's just a weirdo and making things grow around him in the middle of nowhere, and you think, oh yeah, that's just something that a person like that would do. But it's like, no. There are reasons why people become hermits, and he never really had a chance to explain it. No sooner had they left the protective canopy of Wilmode's oasis than a giant form descended upon the entire party. And that giant was a skeleton, ice-covered aurochs, which I didn't know what an aurochs was until I played this game the first time a few years ago. It's kind of like an oxen, but bigger and more badass. But yeah, essentially the embodiment of Remergod. So Remergod, the actual god, was embodied in this form, and it's 900 AI, perhaps that was a year when they still did that kind of a thing. They don't really do that as much anymore by Pillars of Eternity. But anyway, the god of entropy, Remergod, really did not like Wilmode. In fact, Wilmode, like the very existence of Wilmode, was the exact opposite of the god of entropy, that is Remergod. And so he hated Wilmode. And this giant ice-covered skeleton aurochs would just try to pummel and destroy Wilmode at any given chance he could. This is why Wilmode was a hermit, why he was hiding out, so that he wouldn't be getting destroyed by Remergod. However, every time that the god of entropy, Remergod, would break a limb off, or his body would like freeze and a piece of his body would just fall off, or even rot off, because again, he would have the same kind of aura around him that Kamatu did, if not more powerfully. a new limb would grow in its place. So this nature godlike guy, Wamode, he'd have his arm knocked off, and then a new arm would basically just start growing there. Right, so this is basically what happened there. And we don't really talk much about the party of hunters anymore. No one knows what happened to them. Nobody cares. The really important thing is that Wamode and Remergon got into this huge fight, and Remergon, with his giant hooves, was just smashing the ground where Wamode was, and eventually created a huge canyon in the middle of the White That Wins, which apparently you were in the White That Wins, you could go there and you could see it. And legend tells that there is a lush jungle or a lush forest at the bottom of this canyon, but nobody knows because it's unreachable. It's just way too deep. But that Wamode still lives there today. And in fact, Remergon is still fighting Wamode down there, which is why Remergon, or at least the icy skeletal Oryx embodiment of Remergon, is not seen as much anymore. This is kind of like the justification or rationalization for like, hey, why don't we see the Aurochs of Remergon very much anymore? It's like, oh, because he's fighting Wamode at the bottom of the canyon, and they will never stop fighting each other. And that's just kind of the myth or legend there. But yeah, there's Wamode. What are his powers in a fight that he's basically got like those Wolverine super regenerative powers? Like it sounds like no matter what you do, he's just going to regrow parts of his body. I don't know if he lop his head off if it would do something. I imagine the Remergon would probably have thought of doing that, and obviously it hasn't worked yet, so I don't know. It does say here that Wamode apparently fell in defeat, but nobody knows for sure. I personally would like to think that he's still alive at the bottom of the canyon, although he might have died of old age at this point. I don't know. It seems kind of unfitting that a person that exudes an aura of life around them wouldn't eventually die and become part of that natural world around them. I don't know. That's just me kind of speculating there. Next up is Saint Agatha the Blind. Saint Agatha is an interesting one. One that we're going to have to touch on different topics of lore to understand fully. But she was born on an Aediran farm, Aedir being another empire within this world, just as old as Rauatai or the Grand Valia Empire. But yeah, she was born on an Aediran farm. Aedir is where your player character from Avowed's coming from, by the way. Agatha lived basically a normal life, and she was just out one day in her teenage years gathering gear and provisions for her farmer life, I suppose, and went missing. And it wasn't until 3 days later that they actually found her wandering aimlessly out around the mine's entrance that she was plundering for gear and provisions. Now, a lot of people thought that she had just inhaled a lot of the bad fumes that were in the mines and resulted in her losing her sight. However, Agatha herself was claiming that something else happened, that she had touched an ornate engraved wall of Adra that was kind of coming out of the stone from within the mine. Adra in this world is a gem-like resource. It's just a naturally occurring gemstone. The really interesting thing about Adra is that it can hold essence, which is the stuff that souls are made of in this world. So yeah, souls can go into Adra. They're kind of like soul stones, if you will, or soul gems, if that's what kind of parlance you're used to. But yeah, so she found this wall of Adra with engravings on it, and she touched it. She saw visions of bright towers rising out of the land and nothing else. But she was blind to everything else. That's it. So all she can see are these giant, bright towers rising out of the grounds, and she can't see anything else. For those who are well familiar with the lore of Pillars of Eternity, you actually know already what's going on, but I'll just put it in straight terms for you. Essentially, she has gained the abilities of a watcher, but just the watcher parts, and she's lost her regular sight. I'll explain what I mean here. So she went back to town, and a local mystic of Wall being one of the gods of this world, the really weird one with all the eyes, that's about dreams and secrets and revelations and mystery. Anyways, basically determined that, oh yeah, she's had an awakening of her soul, and she's gained latent abilities of a watcher. The really interesting thing about watchers is that watchers gain kind of like a new sense where they can interact with essence around them. They can actually see souls, and they can interact with souls, and they can even talk with souls. Now, people can't do that normally in this world or in our real world, right? You can't just look at a soul, but a watcher can. They just have this ability to see and interact with souls directly. But a normal watcher would also retain their other senses where they could see around the normal mundane world around them. Agatha has lost that. She now can only see the spiritual around her. She can only see souls. She can only see these bright towers, which are probably veins of Adra deposits within the world, because a lot of soul energy is within these deposits of Adra. Unfortunately for Agatha, she was born into a society that really is wary of animancy, animancy being the science of souls. In fact, animancy, I believe, is either outlawed or heavily, heavily regulated, depending on what time she's living in within the Aedirian history. And so they don't really want her around anymore. So they actually sail her out on a boat towards the Eastern Reach, which is where a colony of the Aedirian Empire is, the Deerwood. So Agata goes across the ocean to the new continent of the Eastern Reach because she's basically an outcast now because, she has something to do with animancy, and we don't like that stuff over here. So she goes over there where animancy is a little more accepted. This is the new world, and they're a little more embracing of this kind of fringe science stuff or this really questionable things. There's a lot of contention around animancy, and if you want to listen about it, I think it's episode 17. You can go and listen to that. It's a really interesting topic, one that's central to all the stories in Eora, including Avowed, I'm going to guess. But she found a lot more people accepting of her in the Eastern Reach. She went to a place called Brackenberry Sanitarium, but they were more interested in studying her than helping her. But she did eventually go to a place called Dunreed Row, which were people that actually valued her for who she was. They still weren't interested in curing her of her ailment, but instead convinced her that she wasn't cursed with blindness, she was gifted with spiritual sight. And she eventually learned to accept that about herself and treated it as a gift rather than a curse. In the ensuing years, Agata was able to make a name for herself as an investigator with unlawful deaths. Can you imagine, right? If you're an investigator, you go to a crime scene, oh, look at that. Whose spirit and whose soul is standing above the dead body? Well, the person who was killed. How about we just ask them, hey, who killed you? What happened here? Thanks. That was easy. So Agata really made a good name for herself, and people would be comforted when they saw her enter into a crime scene. And that was kind of the name that Saint Agata made for herself, and that's really all that's going on here. There's one more paragraph about what happens to her later on, but it has something to do with the events of the First Pillars game, and I'm just going to leave that because I don't want to include spoilers here, and it doesn't really say anything that I think you need to necessarily know. But yeah, there you go. So her superpower, if you will, is that she has true spiritual sight, and she can interact with your soul, which could mean more than just talking to it, by the way. She could potentially also manipulate your soul, I think, if she knew how to do it. And lastly, we're going to talk about Saint Grotesque and the Captain. This one is a very interesting one, and it also kind of harkens back to another piece of lore, another small piece of lore that we learn about from the First Pillars game. Among the stranger and more obscure folktales out of the Eastern Reach lurks Back Alley Midden, an ooze possessing some echo of intelligent awareness. Now, if you're interested in learning of who or what Back Alley Midden is, check out my episode on, I believe it's called Primordials, was the episode I did. It was a type of creature. An ooze is a type of creature. It's if I can describe what an ooze in this world is, you're probably familiar with it from like Dungeons and Dragons or other fantasy media, but the best way I can describe it is a bunch of garbage got together and became sentient is kind of the best I can describe it as, and it really kind of is what it is, right? It's just all this like refuse and garbage and other things that had latent essence in it, stuff that souls are made of, and so it kind of gained a level of sentience in the sense that it became aware and it wanted to seek out more essence to become bigger. Oozes are very common in the world. They are very dangerous. If you are lurking around in like sewer systems or something, one can just drop from the ceiling, envelop you, and then slowly dissolve you or eat you or whatever it is they want to do. But they're not going to end the world or anything, right? They're dangerous on their own right, but if you know how to avoid them, then you'll be okay. There was, however, one notorious ooze that was referred to as Back Alley Midden and was said to have reached the size of an actual humanoid, and could sometimes even take the shape of a humanoid to trick people into thinking it was one. Thing is that oozes aren't supposed to have really high intelligence, so why they would have thought of that, I don't know. Maybe as they get bigger, they get higher intelligence. Anyways, what does that have to do with Saint Grotesque and the Captain? Here's the story. There was a ship full of religious pilgrims that were in the Deadfire Archipelago. They were sailing through, and they came under attack by a giant sea monster. A sea monster of legendary size is what it says here. They were not doing well. They're barely able to hold their own, and it seems like they weren't going to make it. And then, all of a sudden, off in the distance, a strange, discolored vessel crested on the horizon, bearing an overpowering stench. Though the outline of its hull resembled a Valian warship, this one possessed no sails or mast. Instead, it propelled itself through the water with the aid of 4 massive fins beneath the waves. So, without just reading everything straight from the book. Basically what happened is that Back Alley Midden grew to such a huge size that it's actually the size of basically a warship. And so what it did is it reformed itself, and it held itself in this form of that kind of like a Valian warship, and was just flying across the Deadfire Archipelago. The more interesting thing here, though, besides the fact that we're, given a description of what it looked like upon closer inspection, is that it had a whole bunch of splintered wood and bones and coral and garbage and a whole bunch of other things in it, which is how oozes grow. It just takes more and more refuse. But there also was a person standing on this ooze ship. So, long story short, Back Alley Midden and its mysterious captain arrive on the scene, help out, save the people, and then act as an envoy for them to get back to a safe area within the Deadfire Archipelago. There was an agreement that the pilgrims that were on this ship struck with the captain of the Grotesque, which was essentially, we'll tow you to safety, and then once you're in a safe place, you let my ship eat your ship, and then my ship will get bigger. And that was kind of, I don't know, that was kind of the thing that they had going on there. And so they're like, yeah, hey, we'll die out here, so we'll do that. So they go somewhere close to a giant reef called the Great Reef in the Deadfire Archipelago. They get dropped off, they're safe, and Back Alley Midden, the ship, basically eats this pilgrim ship, and thus it gets bigger and stronger, right? Continuing its conquest of becoming the biggest, most unstoppable force in all of Eora. At least that's kind of where my mind goes. I'm like, this would make a really good endgame boss one day, or ally, who knows. But that's Saint Grotesque and the Captain. And I particularly like that one. It's just a goofball story. But yeah, what would Saint Grotesque's powers be? Well, it's essentially a huge ooze that is capable of eating things smaller than itself, and I would say at this point including people, and thereby making itself stronger. And we don't really know, obviously, in the lore at all, but we can speculate on like how powerful an ooze gets as it gets bigger. Like, how capable is this thing? So there we have the 5 saints that we find within the Pillars of Eternity Guidebook Volume 2, and I don't want to ask the question of which one of them would win in a fight.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
Now, I don't want it to just to be like, oh, they're, in a circle and they're fighting each other. Like, whatever fiction you have to make in your mind to be like, why are they trying to subdue each other? Let's just go with that. Let's say these 5 people get into some sort of match and they have to overpower each other. My question is, who would come out on top? I already discussed kind of like Kamatu. He's got the power of he's got the aura of death around him. Things just like unravel and decay. We have Saint Kanja, the negotiator, who basically can talk anyone into doing anything she wants. Saint Wamode, the Grove, is the opposite of Saint Kamatu. He basically can just regrow body parts at whim. It has been in battle with apparently a god for a very long time and is just possibly not dead. We don't actually know, but according to legend, could still actually be alive, so hard to kill that one. You have Saint Agata the Blind, who has the ability to interact with souls, which, is a little underpowered to me. I feel like, her body is still a little bit mundane, so all it takes is one good whack and she'd be done for. But the ability to interact with a soul is not a light one. I mean, you, the player character in the first Pillars of Eternity game, you're a watcher and you accomplish some pretty big things. So who knows what Saint Agata, someone who can only see in the spiritual sense, can do with her powers. And lastly, we have Saint Grotesque and the Captain, a captain with a giant ooze that can eat almost anything and become anything that it wants. Well, not become, it can kind of like shape-shift itself in the form of something, but whatever. We have those 5. I will say right off the bat, I don't think Saint Agata is going to have much of a chance. I do think that her watcher powers might give her advantage in some situations, but honestly, if Back Alley Midden falls on her, she's pretty much done for. She's just a normal person, right? So I don't think Saint Agata would be the one to survive. And same goes for Kamatu. I really think that all it takes is one good hit from Kamatu and they would die, unless Remergond is protecting him from death in some way. Now, Saint Kanja, the negotiator, along with Saint Wamode and Saint Grotesque, those are the 3 that I'm kind of contending around each other. Saint Kanja, I think, is also very mundane, very easily killable. However, could she convince someone that what she's saying is true, right? Could she convince the person to not attack them? It seems likely, right? Except for the fact that Saint Grotesque isn't really something that you can interact with in that way. So we don't know what the relationship between Back Alley Midden is and the captain of this creature ship. Whether one and the other are the same or anything like that. So I don't know how far she would be able to go in negotiating her life that way. Saint Wilmode, I don't know. He doesn't seem very violent, but seems impossible to kill. But again, would Kadza be able to convince Wilmode to leave or forfeit is the thing. And so I don't know. If it was just a straight up killing match, I feel like Saint Wilmode is the one who is unkillable. He wouldn't be able to kill it, therefore reign victorious. But in the question of who can subdue each other, I really think it comes down to Saint Grotesque, Saint Kadza, of like, can Kadza convince Grotesque of the thing that it needs to do? If she can, then she would win. If she can't, then Grotesque would win. But then if Grotesque wins in subduing, then perhaps Saint Wilmode would actually come back and then prevail over Grotesque. I don't know who would win between those two, but anyways, this is kind of where my mind's going, and I'm trying not to think of it in terms of fisticuffs. I'm trying to think of it in terms of like, if they had a goal and they were against each other, who would find a way to come out on top if it really came down to the grind. And that's just kind of what I think, and it's just for fun. But whatever, it's my podcast. I'll do what I want. If you don't like it, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. However, also, if you want to send me not a nasty email and you also want to send me your thoughts on who do you think would win between these five, send me an email. If you are interested, I can even read them out in the show for the next episode. But yeah, that's everything today. Thanks everyone for listening. Not really anything Avowed related. The only thing in this that I think is related to Avowed, well, one, the potential of maybe seeing some of these people in the game of Avowed. Saint Wilmode might still be alive, but he's in the like opposite side of the world, so I don't see that happening. Back Alley Midden, though, has traveled from the Eastern Reach continent over the Deadfire Archipelago. Who knows? Maybe that thing is still alive, and Back Alley Midden makes its way over to Avowed. Okay, Obsidian, please. That would be so good. Like, that's such a deep Easter egg that, like, only people who are, like, really paying attention to a lot of the stories would know about that. You can actually read about Back Alley Midden in some of the lore in the game itself. It's not just in this book. But St. Kamatu, for example, you can only read about in this book. But yeah, that would be such a cool thing. And it would just be an ooze, but bigger, right? So if you already have oozes in the game, I don't know if it's hard to, like, in, like, some unexplored corner of the world, just put a giant ooze and give it the label Back Alley Midden. And even if it doesn't lead to something, that's a great Easter egg. You gotta admit that, like, that's pretty good. Okay, that's enough of that. But yeah, that's all I can think of. The only other thing I can think of related to Avowed is that we will see this depth of writing potentially in Avowed. Now, it's a different game. It's got a different delivery method for lore and for narrative. So it'll be different. There's no other way to really say it. Like, when you play Pillars of Eternity, you're basically reading a book, right? And so the amount of description that they can give is different than how they're going to deliver that stuff in a game like Avowed, which is more of an action RPG. You know what I'm saying? So who knows how in-depth they're going to get with this stuff. They're still going to have lore books, presumably, in Avowed. But anyways, that's the only other thing I can think of, is that we'll still get the depth of writing within the game. But those are my thoughts for the day. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Now comes the question of, like, what have I been playing lately, for those of you who care. I finished Prey. I actually just finished Prey today. It was a good game, but I've kind of come to the realization that I am just not in the mood for games like that right now, with, like, long-running narratives and backtracking and tons of side quests, which is like, oh boy, are you going to want to play Avowed when it comes out? Yes, I am, because I love the world and I love the stuff that Obsidian makes. But I think right now I'm just kind of in a mood of playing smaller games. So I'm getting my gaming crew back together, which is my brother and one of my friends, and we're jumping back into Fallout 76. We're probably going to go back into Grounded once the 1.6 update comes up. Oddly enough, though, a game I have been playing lately, and, like, don't judge me when you first hear it, just hear me out. I feel like I've earned that with a lot of you. I've been playing for the last couple days, like, only in, like, half an hour spurts at a time, though. I've been playing Lego Fortnite, which is not a game I would normally play, but I was looking on the internet for games like Grounded that had the shared world feature, and Lego Fortnite kept popping up, and I'm like, I wonder if the game is fun to play, because if it's fun to play, then, you know, even if, you know, it's not necessarily in my wheelhouse, at least it has that feature, which would be great for my gaming crew. And so I started playing it, and you know what? Like, it does everything competently. I haven't really gotten into it yet, so I can't say a lot, but it's got all the shticks of a survival crafting game. You know, there's a bunch of rocks and a bunch of wood lying around. You build stuff with it, and then you use those things to build more complex things. You can eventually build a village, and eventually you can have NPCs come and live in your village. I don't know what goes on from there, but apparently there's an entire game to play within it. And if it does have that feature where I can have my friends come in, even if I'm not logged on, they can come into my world and they can just do stuff and it perpetuates when I log in later, even if they're offline. To me, I'm like, that feature alone makes a game so much more communal that it's worth playing. And besides that, I'm not saying that Lego Fortnite is going to win any awards down the line. I don't know because I haven't played enough of it, but it's very competently done, right? Like all the things that you need in a survival crafting game are there. They are done well and they are done competently. Again, am I thinking they're winning awards? So far, not really, but it's a game that I've been playing and I think that it plays well, it handles well, the mechanics are straightforward. There's a couple things I'm a little confused on how to do mechanically, but whatever, I can look those up. So yeah, I don't know, I'll report to you guys later about how that goes. Hopefully it turns out to be something that me and my gaming crew can get into. I really like games that do that shared world thing because it means that even if your friends can't log on for the day, you can still go into the game and do stuff by yourself and feel like you're contributing. Like when I play Grounded with my friends, if they couldn't be online that day and I'm like, well, I don't have anything else I want to play, I go into Grounded, even if I just spend 45 minutes harvesting grass and putting it somewhere, that means when my friends log on, they don't have to do that. Like I'm still contributing to the group goal, the group project that we're working on. And yeah, like I really, really valued Grounded for that. And I'm looking forward to playing other games like Lego Fortnite or even Nightingale, which is apparently supposed to have the same kind of feature. But I'll wait until I have a better PC for that. But yeah, that's everything for today. Thanks everyone for listening, where we just talked about 5 religious figureheads from Eora's history, and we asked who would win in a fight. I am interested in knowing your guys' responses, so send me an email at worldofeora@gmail.com if you're interested in answering the question, or even just asking me questions, or starting a conversation about games. Love talking about games. Tell me the most recent game you've been playing. Like, talk about yourself. I don't care. I love this stuff. If you want to hit me up on Twitter, at World of Eora is the place to do that. If you're interested in supporting the show, if you've been listening for a while and you're like, hey, I'd like to give to the show to help to provide anything in case, if my microphone ever breaks and I need to replace it, hopefully there's something in the back there. If you want to support the show for things like that, you can go to my Ko-fi account, ko-fi.com/World of Eora. All the funds there are used for podcast related stuff. So if that's something you're interested in doing, go ahead and do it. If that's not something that you're interested in doing, then don't worry about it. It's just there for those who want to. That's everything for today. Thanks, everybody. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.